Okay, while we're waiting for everyone to join, are there any questions about anything? I didn't upload the lecture with all the images in it yet. I'm going to do that today. I got your assignment ones, including some of you who missed the deadline and had to email it to me. That's certainly fine. Any sort of questions or problems or concerns or worried about how to get through life? Nathan, you're lit up. Oh, you were lit up. I trust everyone can hear me, right? Can I get a thumbs up?
I can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. All right. So what I want to do today, obviously, I've begun to believe that the lectures that are recorded with the images and everything and the PowerPoints are more full, and that perhaps what I'd like to do today is similar to what I did last Tuesday, which is talk about these things in general. So in a sense, you'll have two lectures uh, to work with this week. But I do want to say one thing. I want to share screen for a second and go to your course a module. The New Nation module is very big. The reason it's big is because Dr. Freeman has this excellent Open Yale course with a really good series of lectures that explain the Constitution, development of the Constitution. Okay. Really excellent. Now, to listen to all of those will take 4 hours, but I hope you're able to do that. And again, it's one of those things you can have going on in the background. This one, Did Jesus Write the Constitution, is a sort of a podcast with a humorous title that attempts to understand why there's so much talk about uh, the Constitution being being a divine gift. Okay, and that's an interview I had with an historian from Penn State. So the regular lecture will go up, the regular this and the lecture with the images will go up in here like they normally do. Okay, so let me stop share about that. And by the way, I've also obviously put the discussion in the discussion board. Now, what I did this time, because of what you recommended last week, was I put in all the questions and all the names, right? And then I started, because one of you recommended this, or several of you recommended, I can't remember, that I start by writing the questions, and then the threaded replies would fall underneath, so there isn't a repetition of the first question of the questions throughout the flow of the thing. And I'll try to keep remembering to do that. So I hope that works out okay. So anything about that kind of thing before I start? Okay. I think what's important is to remember that not only that things are really complicated, as they always are in this period, but to constantly remember that things were contingent. There's no evidence at all to suggest that uh, once the American Revolution is over, and they try the Articles of Confederation for a few days, and then it doesn't work. That the United States was eventually leading towards a constitutional convention, and the Constitution that we end up with, that's just not the case. So always remember that these things are very contingent. Almost anything could have happened. Now, and I'm not saying that it's chaotic. It is actually a process whereby the founders are struggling with what kind of constitution to have, what kind of government to have, and how to make that government work the best. And for the most part, the arguments and the debates and the discussions and the back and forth about what to do with this new country actually quite sophisticated. Traditionally, people see the Articles of Confederation, for instance, as this kind of big failure, but and a kind of a weak way to start a new government. But actually, given the situation that the colonies came out of the war in, and given the long-standing individual colonial sort of independence that these colonies felt, it's not surprising that the Articles of Confederation were written the way they were, given the realities of politics and life and everything else, especially international trade. It's also not surprising that the Articles of Confederation ultimately didn't work. But let's not get into this sort of a battle where we think that the founders were stupid to come up with the articles first, and that the Constitution came down from heaven, because, as we'll see, especially as I talk a little bit later about the Constitutional Convention, an awful lot of what we end up with in the Constitution wasn't based on a tremendous feeling of principle, so much as we need to have a Constitution that will be ratified. So there was an awful lot of compromise, especially between North and South, but perhaps more importantly, between big states and small states. And there isn't really there's an overwhelming sense that a stronger constitution is needed, a stronger national government is needed, but there isn't an overwhelming sense and an overwhelming convincing sense that it should take the form that it did. So none of this stuff is inevitable, right? But I think a lot of what does happen, especially in the immediate aftermath of the war, is understandable. And I used to be one of these people, back in the 20th century, who thought the articles were just stupid. The Articles of Confederation were stupid. They were just a cave into slavery, to slave states, and all that stuff. And it was, it was going to eventually break up the country into 13 little countries and all that kind of thing. But of course, I then went to grad school and learned that it's much more complicated than that, and that, as I keep saying in this class, people are paying attention at the time. They're not just doing this stuff willy-nilly. They aren't quick decisions. They aren't overly ideological decisions. There's a great deal of debates. One of the reasons we know so much about this period is because the debate is so strong. And also, don't forget that the Constitution itself, after it's written, the ratification is not necessarily automatic. And there's a big, huge battle over that. Right? Okay, so again, none of this is inevitable. Contingency matters. But let me first talk about. And by the way, all the images I want to use and everything for this lecture are in the recorded lecture, which as I said, I'll put up. So I'm afraid you're just going to have to look at me or listen to me for today. Which reminds me, I should put the chat up, because if any of you want to stop me and say that the internet has crashed, I suppose all of you folks are too young to. You're of the non-Facebook generation, so I suppose you didn't go through the sort of withdrawal symptoms that everyone my age and went through yesterday when Facebook went down. But it was pretty funny to watch the reactions of people, especially on other platforms like Twitter, when they saw, oh, Facebook is down. How am I going to live? And some wag put up a news post that said something like, Facebook is down, and that means vaccination rates have gone through the roof because no one, people have, they can't go on Facebook, so they might as well go get vaccinated. Well, I thought it was very funny. Anyway, there, I put the chat up in case something happens. So here's the situation after the war. The United States has won the war. The Treaty of Paris has been signed and all that stuff. And the question of what to do with the national government is brought up. And as I said, because of the way the colonies had developed sort of as independent entities and mature independent entities, that's very important. They come up with this idea for a relatively weak national government under the Articles of Confederation. Now, this is the first written constitution of the U.S., right? There's a one-house Congress, unicameral legislature, no president, no federal judiciary. Okay. Really, the only powers that the national government had were declaring war, conduct of foreign affairs, making treaties, sort of stuff like that. And under the Articles, if you wanted to change the Articles, that required unanimous consent, right? Not 2/3 or anything like that we're used to nowadays. Unanimous consent. So no proposal to amend the Articles of Confederation ever passed because of that. So having said that, however, the thing that the national government does take on as its sort of as the sole responsible power is the West. Okay, in the immediate aftermath of independence, Congress took the position that by the fact that they helped the British, Native Americans had forfeited their right to lands. Okay, so that was they were sort of like fellow travelers with the British, so they lost the in the view of the article of the Confederation Congress, they viewed that they had no rights over the land. Now, the other thing, though, that the other pressure that was upon them was on the Congress is that there were a lot of settlers that wanted to move west and expand west. Okay, so land speculators and settlers on the one hand, plus this idea that Native Americans should be punished and dispossessed of land because of their alliance with the British was very, very strong. Right. So what this essentially means is that, but of course, there are no real ways in which states can themselves control their Western territories, even though technically speaking, a lot of them have this endless boundary. The boundary for Virginia, the boundary for Pennsylvania go all the way to the Pacific coast in theory, right? If you look at maps at this time, you'll see that Pennsylvania has no Western state line. Virginia has no Western state line. Other states like Ohio and Kentucky and these things come in later. And so, in theory, Pennsylvania could, I don't know what the latitude of Pennsylvania is, but it could go all the way out to Oregon, what is now Oregon. But anyway, Congress takes control over that. Okay. So what happens is that in 1784, they established a number of land ordinances. The Land Ordinance Act of 1784, exciting stuff. And what it does is it establishes stages of self-government in the West. And then another ordinance act, Land Ordinance Act of 1785, regulated land sales north of the Ohio River and established the way settlement was to happen in the West. Okay, so this was all done again by the federal government. Virginia and Pennsylvania, especially because they were powerful states and they sort of had this sweep out west, could have fought this, but they did. Well, that's something they did fight it rhetorically, but nothing uh, ever happened. So, but they couldn't overcome the idea that Congress, the Confederation Congress, was the one responsible for what happens in the West. And for the most part, the Confederation Congress allows private companies and speculators to go out and stake out land and sell it. Okay. For the most part, that continues unabated. And also, another thing that's passed. Sometimes I think this course should just be called the West, because everything that seems to happen in the first half of American history has to do with the West in one way or another. Of course, the West is a moving target in the sense that at one stage Pittsburgh was the West, and then the West just keeps moving west. But the West is always this issue of what do we do about the West? How do we organize the West? And how should Western settlement happen? Okay. Now but there's the problems with the Articles of Confederation and with the Confederation Congress. Okay. The biggest problem right away was the war debt. The war had created basically an economic crisis that the Confederation government couldn't adequately adopt, and so states more or less came up with their own economic policies. This is a very interesting but very, very complicated thing to study in this time. And it's also one of the reasons why there's something called Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion is this very interesting revolt by debt-ridden farmers in Western Massachusetts, right? Their land was in danger of being seized. So a number of farmers led by a man named Daniel Shays protested against this and used, very importantly, used a lot of symbols, used a lot of rhetoric, used a lot of imagery from the Revolutionary era: liberty trees, liberty caps, liberty poles, all those things I've shown you before. Now, this was put down, obviously, by the Massachusetts governor in 1787. By the way, the rebellion breaks out in 1786, put down in 1787. 1,000 people arrested. But what Shays' Rebellion showed was that there was a need for a stronger central government to protect basically property rights from too much power in the hands of the people. The Shays rebels wanted to take over other property that they didn't necessarily own from larger landowners in order to help pay their debts. And the argument was, look, we fought for the revolution. We didn't really get adequately compensated for that. And so we should be able to claim a lot of this land. So you have the development after Shays' Rebellion of a group of people that historians call nationalists in the 1780s. Nationalists were those who believed that there needed to be a stronger, not necessarily overwhelmingly strong, but stronger national central government. These are James Madison, Alexander Hamilton of musical fame, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They wanted increased national authority. Okay, and these people, and George Washington is sort of a nationalist too. Let's explain that more a little bit later. You could call them centralists, but I don't want to give you the impression that nationalists in this period were all for a completely centralized government in New York, and the rest of the country is just sort of like minions to New York. Although Alexander Hamilton famously believed that really state government should be only just sort of administrative units, right? That all decisions and everything should take place in the national government, all major decisions anyway, in the national government, and then the states would administer those, but you wouldn't have governors and things like that. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. The other thing was the fact that the Articles seemed to lead to a weakness across the country. Led a lot of people who had developed, if you will, a national consciousness during the war to believe that there needed to be a stronger national central government. They believed that the United States had won this war against this huge empire, but now it was going to break up into these little itty bitty states and sort of fritter away like banana republics over the years. There was a great deal of national pride brought about by the revolution. The idea was that the country needed to become a power on par with Britain and France, and it's never going to do that if we have basically 13, or so I shouldn't say 13, 12 or 10 different governments at any one time. Okay, so the kind of the nationalists within the military and within the revolutionary generation, and they sort of nationalists among the people who are participating in the revolution, they sort of gravitated to this nationalist groups, right? The other problem was that the there were bonds issued, right, and the bondholders that held these bonds were fearing that if the Articles of Confederation fail, or if the government failed, they're not going to be paid off. And so they not only wanted to pay off war debts, but they also had issued bonds in order to support the early days of the country. Other economic problems included artisans wanted tariff protection especially from a European artisans, and also merchants wanted access to British markets, but they didn't want this constant problem of having a relatively small group of people, the New Jersey delegation, negotiating with the British Board of Trade, which is massive, was just a joke. It was like David and Goliath, but Goliath would always win. So the nationalists want to have, at least in economic terms, a Goliath approaching the British Board of Trade Goliath in order to make reasonable negotiations. Okay, so what happens is there's these nationalists have a meeting in Annapolis in Maryland, right, center of the country, north south anyway, September 1786, and they call for a convention. This is very, very important to have this distinction. Call for a convention to amend the Articles of Confederation. Okay, amend them, not scrap them, not yet anyway. Not replace them with something completely new, but they want to amend the Articles of Confederation so that on the one hand, there isn't anarchy. On the other hand, there isn't a sort of a demagogue who comes out and becomes a monarch because the country needs control. And then, sorry, on the third hand, if you will, the government does, the country doesn't immediately just give up and turn itself over to the French or even back to the British. So this Annapolis Convention is extremely important, but it has lots of different motivations behind it. It's not just this. The nationalists don't sit down and say, all right, guys, we need to have a new constitution. It needs to be written by James Madison, and we need to have this many articles, blah blah blah. The idea was to amend the Articles of Confederation. But once they have this meeting and start to sort of get into the details of what's going on with the articles, and sort of thinking through, and again debating through what the articles do well, what they don't do well, realize that pretty quickly that the articles need to be scrapped and that a new constitution needed to be created. And the idea that a constitution, the constitution of the country, small c, how the country was made up, would be a legislature, an executive, and a national judiciary, comes from this Annapolis Convention. Okay, the thing that the debating part, the part that was disagreed on, was how to create a national government that yet still retains the Republican ideals, small r Republican ideals. Okay, Republican ideals of representation and small government in order to maintain the closeness to the people. So we had to, the Annapolis Convention really very early on debated a great deal about the competing claims of liberty on the one hand and power on the other hand. Okay, so there were two basic proposals that came out of these debates: the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. The Virginia plan, which was favored by more populous states, so it would have a two-house legislature, right, two houses, in which the state's population determined its representation in both houses. Then there was the New Jersey plan, favored by the smaller states, right, in which a one-house legislature in which each state cast one vote. So all of a sudden, New Jersey would have the same power as New York in this legislature, or same power as Massachusetts, even though it had nowhere near the population to reflect that. So eventually, to make a long story short, there's a compromise, and they come up with a two-house Congress consisting of a Senate. Each state gets two senators, and a House of Representatives where the state's apportionment of representatives was created by their population, calculated by their population. Now, I'll get to how this relates to the 3/5 clause in a minute. But again, in order to keep in mind this constant battle between national power and republicanism. National power meaning the stronger national government, and republicanism meaning a weaker national government, stronger state and local governments. That's a very, very that runs throughout the entire Constitutional Convention. So a number of things are given to the states. The determination of who to vote, who could vote, right? Voter qualifications. In a trade-off for that, the president, the new executive, would appoint federal judges. The president would be elected by an electoral college. And if that electoral college ever tied, it would be thrown into the House of Representatives, and that would be, by the way, one state, one vote in the House of Representatives. And by the way, so the Electoral College is a sort of indirect election, partly because a compromise between the big states and the small states, but also because, and I don't want to go into this in too much depth, because there wasn't, even though there had been kind of a national consciousness when it came to the military and things like that, there wasn't as much of a national consciousness when it came to political leaders, right? People knew who George Washington was. They knew who probably the top 10 founders were, but they didn't necessarily know everybody in the country, and they felt a sort of distributed or a distanced electoral system would be better. You in Westmoreland County, you don't know who the two candidates were. You know that there are candidates for president, but you don't really know them. Not like we do now. Obviously, this doesn't count when George Washington is elected. That's an exception. But you know your local mayor or your local town leader or whatever, and you trust that person. And so the idea is that you would then vote for him as an elector, or you might vote for some other guy as the elector, right, for your area, and you send that elector off to New York to decide to actually cast the vote for president. Okay, I don't know about I myself, as a Westmoreland, the late 18th century Westmoreland County person, don't know enough about this stuff, even though I'm a property owner and I'm I'm a prominent member of my citizens, but I trust John Smith, right? And so I'm going to delegate my voting for president to John Smith. Okay, and he's the one who goes to New York and does it. That's how the Electoral College works. Right now, the other thing that the big development that comes out of the Constitutional Convention is, of course, the division and the separation of powers. What in the 70s and 80s historians and political scientists used to call the sharing of powers. And it's very interesting to think about these terms that we use: separation of powers, division of powers. And as I think political scientists now still argue, there's a great deal of sharing of power. So, for instance, you see all kinds of things happening in Washington nowadays where the president will propose something, he has to deal with Congress, and they go back and forth all the time. The president proposes a Supreme Court justice, that has to be get the advice and consent of the Senate. That's a whole big sort of intertwining of that power, appointment power. So really, the president and the Senate appoint the federal judiciary. Anyway, so that's what we mean when we talk about separation of power, division of power, sharing of power, and also the famous checks and balances. Okay, now this is not the word. The phrase checks and balances is not in the Constitution, but the kind of idea is there. The checks and balances, not only, however, with the separation of powers in the national government, the checks and balances exist between the national government and the states, and this is what is known as federalism. Okay? A federal system of government is one in which power is dispersed to the regions. Okay, there are basically two types of government in this scenario. One is a centralized or national government, and the other is a federalized government, which there is a central government, but a lot of the day-to-day power over people's lives goes to the states. Now, the states couldn't issue money, they couldn't impair contracts, they couldn't levy their own import duties or customs duties, but almost all daily affairs of people, education, voting, as I mentioned, law enforcement, all that was delegated to the states. You don't remember this because it was before you were born, but there are still a number of federal countries in the world. Canada very much is a federation. The different territories in Canada and provinces in Canada have a lot of power. Australia is a federal government. Germany used to be a federal. Well, so I guess Germany still is a federalized system, but before the end of the Cold War, the Federal Republic of Germany was West Germany, and the different German states had a lot of power, but in none of those cases were the states or the territories or the regions or the provinces anywhere near as powerful as American states were in their origin and in their development. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is, over and over and over and over again in the Constitutional Convention, there's a constant battle or a constant belief that if these powers are shared, both between the executive, judicial, and legislative branches at the national level, and between the national level and the state level, if there's a constant back and forth and sharing of these powers, there's much less likely a chance that the government will end up being tyrannical. Okay, it's unlikely. So they thought that a certain political demagogue would become so powerful and so popular that the United States would end up with a monarchy, for instance. Okay, because you could never get everybody to agree on that. So that's a very very common theme in the Constitutional Convention. How do we make sure that we don't end up with some form of absolutism? But also the other theme, and again, I don't want to give the impression that people sat down and thought this through ahead of time. Didn't say, "Oh, we need to have several themes in this Constitutional Convention. What do you want?" When they come up with these sort of a program, sort of a PowerPoint presentation. That's not what happened at all. What happened at all was that it was so difficult to agree on things, and we'll see when I talk about the ratification in a minute, that they end up coming up with this constant compromise. The overwhelming reason the Constitution is the way it is because the framers of the Constitution felt they had to write something that would get approved. Okay? Not necessarily something that was ideologically pure or even political sciency, the best way to run the government. But something that everyone would agree with, or that enough people would agree with it to get it passed. Okay. Now, I need to talk about slavery, which is another big thing that runs theme that runs through the Constitutional Convention, and that's not surprising at all because slavery is one of, if not the biggest element that runs through the early part uh, of American history. Slavery divided the delegates to the Constitutional Convention. The word slave and slavery don't appear in the Constitution, but the Constitution protected slavery by allowing those decisions to be made by the states. Okay, and one of the reasons this happens is that the South Carolina delegates were so strong and were so adamant about their uh, desire to not only preserve slavery but preserve the slave trade, which was a lot of Northeasterners wanted to abolish the slave trade. This was in the late 18th century. This was the kind of hot topic, the kind of trendy thing to believe in was the abolition of the slave trade, right? And most people thought it was the first way to step towards and ending slavery. But anyway, South Carolina is especially strong in saying, whoa, 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 wait a minute. We want slavery to be absolutely preserved the way it is. Any sort of um, um, diminution of the slave trade was going to be immediately uh, uh, rejected by the South Carolina government. So eventually, South Carolina threatens, we're not going to uh, agree if slavery is even mentioned in the Constitution. We're not going to agree if the slave trade is banned immediately. The slave trade is banned, but there's a sort of a waiting period. And so, in order not to let South Carolina go, and if South Carolina go, Georgia would probably almost certainly go. The founders agreed to leave slavery more or less alone. Okay. However, this is why why history is the greatest subject ever. What you have in the Constitutional Convention is an intensification of belief in, for instance, the anti-slavery movement, right? Because a lot of people come home from the Constitutional Convention and say, "Oh my goodness, this slavery thing. We think slavery is going to die a natural death, but these Southern colonies believe in it like it was written in the Bible, and we're never going to get rid of it. So we had to sort of compromise our way out of it, but but it sort of increased the desire to eventually end it, and it strengthened slavery on the slave state side because they were constantly then worried from then on, right, that the bigger more populous, what would eventually become more industrial states in the 19th century would eventually be chock full of fire-breathing anti-slave radicals who would abolish slavery and ruin um, the southern economy. So even though it's one of the things to complain about the Constitution, that the Constitution doesn't either abolish the slave trade right away or abolish slavery, the Constitutional Convention actually sort of amps up anti-slavery sentiment that had been sort of dispersed and ineffective before. But anyway, let me get to what actually happens. Constitution prevents Congress from prohibiting the slave trade until 1808. By the way, if you read the Constitution, it's a very negatively worded document. Every other sentence is Congress shall make no law, blah, 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 blah. Congress shall not, da, 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 da. States shall not, da, 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 da. Right? So it's very much a restricting of power. It's basically an awful lot of the Constitution is what the government can't do, rather than what the government should do. Okay, because it's not open ended in that way. The government should promote freedom. Well, that would be a huge open ended thing. Anyway, so the Congress can't ban the slave trade until 1808. Fugitive slave clause is written was very, very important. Okay, a person who escapes and goes to a non-slave state can be chased and captured by slave catchers and brought back. The state of Pennsylvania cannot, for instance, stop slave catchers from Maryland going into their state and catching these slaves and bringing them back. And perhaps more importantly, the Constitution implied that the federal government could not interfere with slavery in the states. And one of the ways to help accomplish this was that they passed the 3/5 clause. Okay, now all of you know what the 3/5 clause. The 3/5 clause states that when Congress sits down to set up the size of the House of Representatives and how many people sit in the House of Representatives from certain states, from any of the states, you have to determine that on population. Well, if you determined it on free population, which of course the Northerners wanted, then Southern states would have very few members of the House of Representatives, or their numbers would be way down. Virginia would be kind of high, but the other ones would be way down. But the slave states wanted slaves to be counted. And people in the North said, well, what are you crazy? You can't count slaves because they're not free. So there's this compromise, a 3/5 clause, that the entire state population of Virginia, for instance, would be counted, including all the slaves, but it would be divided so that only 3/5 of the number of slaves counted towards Virginia's overall population. And that also means Maryland and Delaware and all the southern states, right? So although, for instance, a lot of people complain nowadays that one of the problems with the Senate was that it was based on slavery, and that's not the case. If anything, the House of Representatives was based on slavery. I can talk more about that at length if you ever want to tired of the sound of my voice. So anyway, that's perhaps the biggest compromise in the Constitution. And in fact, the power of slavery and the power of slave states is shown that I think something like 12 out of the first 15 or 16 presidents, right, were Southern slave owners, even though these states were smaller in population. So anyway, all of these compromise on top of compromise creates a final draft on September 17th, 1787 that's signed. You can read in your primary source reader, there are tons of documents about that. However, one of the things in the Constitution is the Constitution itself had to then be ratified by the states. So you have this whole ratification debate. Remember I forgot what was it? Oh, the Constitution, for instance, that's approved and signed doesn't have any amendments to it, right? That's one of the big debates over whether the Constitution should be ratified. So essentially what happens is the ratification debate breaks down into two different groups. The nationalists on one side, like Alexander Hamilton, and the Republicans on the other side. Okay. And again, this is small R Republican, has nothing to do with the modern day Republican Party. Okay. And the interesting thing about this is one of the many interesting things about this. The Nationalists, of course, want the states to ratify the Constitution, want the stronger national government. The Republicans do not. They want to continue with, or they want to make sure that the Constitution respects states' rights even more than it did, and also respects individual rights more than it did. Okay. The original Constitution says nothing about freedom of speech and everything like that. So anyway, you have these nationalists on the one hand, and you have these Republicans on the other hand. However, in the sort of the first example of the massaging of political rhetoric, or whatever you want to call it, the nationalists call themselves the Federalists. Okay, remember what I said earlier. Federalism is the dispersion of power to the states for the most part. So the nationalists like Alexander Hamilton, who want the strong central government, call themselves the Federalists to give themselves a name that they think will be more appealing to broader public opinion, right? Even though they are not really Federalists. Okay? And then the Republicans on the other side are called anti-federalists because they oppose ratification. They want a small republic, and that they warn that the Constitution would lead to an oppressive national government. So this is why it's confusing, and this is why one of my biggest complaints about the way politics is talked about in the United States is party labels are almost always inaccurate. A lot of them, in this case, for instance, are an example of deliberate use of certain terms in order for the whatever group to appeal to a broader group of people. So you have the Federalists who are really nationalists or centralists, and then you have the anti-federalists who are actually the Federalists because of small f federalism, or Republicans. And they go hammer and tongs about this, and I don't want to go on too long about it, but the Federalists publish a lot of very important pamphlets that are very influential, particularly in the state of New York, which is where first those Federalist papers are directed. Okay, and they sort of win the argument that there needs to be this stronger central government. That sort of carries the day. They don't carry the day in the sense that they don't convince people that we need a Hamiltonian strong federal government, which will only have the states only kind of as limited administrative units. So people sort of buy into that as a whole. The anti-federalists, however, are the ones who push for a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights, which eventually become the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, that has origins way back in the English Bill of Rights in 1688, 1689, and there are various political movements all throughout Europe that talk about having bills of rights and things like that. So it's not an American invention, but the idea that the big compromise is okay will allow the central government on the one hand, but there must be a Bill of Rights to counterbalance. Sorry, I should say to further counterbalance that power of the central government. Do you see what I mean? The idea that, yes, it's great that within the Constitution is a federalist document, small f federalism, and that power is dispersed to the states, and there's a sharing of powers or balance of powers and checks and balances within the three branches of the national government. But we also have to have these guarantees, and that's what the Bill of Rights is supposed to do. So that's the biggest sort of compromise in the ratification. Okay. Now, lots of people, James Madison, for instance, thought that the Constitution didn't need a Bill of Rights. It sort of protected liberties on its own. But there were the critics were very um, powerful, and argued these things. And since there had been a history of a Bill of Rights in the sort of American slash English political consciousness, it didn't seem to be that wacky and and um, far out. So essentially, they agreed to come to. They agree that there will be a Bill of Rights. There will be amendments to the Constitution. Right. Some of the bill. These are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. You can read them and you can see that almost all of them start with Congress shall make no law, blah, 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 blah. Congress shall not do this. Congress shall not do that. So it's restricting the power of the national government. Now, the Bill of Rights is a very interesting sort of thing in the way the Bill of Rights has been come to be seen in different centuries is fascinating. It wasn't really revered in the way that we revere it it becomes to be revered only in the 20th century, partly because of the growth of the nationalism that develops around the U.S. participation in World War I. All kinds of things that we take for granted now, like the display of the flag, the very common display of the flag, the common use of the flag, the national anthem, and the reverence for the Bill of Rights. That's all sort of reaches the height that we know it today. Starts to reach that height in the patriotism surrounding the U.S. involvement in World War I. Okay, so that really is the major thing I'm trying to get at here. The Constitution the Constitution of Canada wasn't. I don't want to say it's a messy process. I don't want to say it was a chaotic process at all, but it was highly debated, and I think there are many things to be admired about that. The fact that the A sat down and debated it, rather than and that the debate went through the country. After all, the Federalist Papers are published in order to convince the public of these things, right? Rather than some sort of dictate from a military commander saying, George Washington wins the war and says, okay, we're going to have this government now, and this is going to how it works. That happens in revolutions in Europe all the time, right? Well, this didn't happen, so they just sit down and debate. But also it's just a huge series of compromises, and the framers are basically constantly under this pressure. We need to have something that will pass, that will be ratified, that will be accepted. So an awful lot of the framers don't agree with everything in the Constitution. They only agree with 4/5 of it or whatever. But they agree to disagree, and they agree that they have to have this document that will get ratification. Okay, so that eventually happens. Rhode Island doesn't ratify, and they just sort of have to be dragooned into accepting it in 1789. But I think that one of the reasons why we continue to see so much dynamism in American history is because this building up of the Constitution was a dynamic process, and that it doesn't stop being dynamic. I can't remember when the 11th Amendment was put in the Constitution, but the Constitution has been amended with something like 26 times. And each of those amendments is equally strong as the First Amendment. Each of those amendments is equally strong as the main text of the Constitution itself. One amendment at least has been repealed. Prohibition was a constitutional amendment, and then was repealed. So it's a very much, I hate to say this because it's one of these things you always hear from the docents and the tour guides at the Constitution Center. It's a living document. Well, yeah, it is a living document. Okay? It's constantly being changed. There are all kinds of things. The Equal Rights Amendment almost got final ratification in 2020, I think. And it continues to be one of these things that's debated. There are all kinds of talks for, amendments. It's a lot of amendments, right? And it's not it's not anti-constitutional to be opposed to certain parts of the Constitution, if you see what I mean. Right? After all, the U.S. eventually had to get rid of the 3/5 clause. Well, what happens is the 3/5 clause eventually becomes irrelevant, but it does, right? Eventually, in the original draft of in the original Constitution, for years and years and years, senators were not elected by the people. Senators were elected by the state legislatures. So you would have the election would come. You would vote for all your people to go to Harrisburg, governor, local state people, and then they would hold a separate election within the legislature to elect the senators to go to Washington. What's known as the direct election of senators was a majorly controversial thing. It's completely forgotten about, and I've forgotten what number amendment it is, but it was extremely important development, and that happened 140 years after 130 years or something like that after the Constitution was ratified. So it's again the dynamism in the compromise, but also the dynamism in how the Constitution is operates for the rest of American history up until now is fascinating, and it's one of the reasons why we talk about it all the time, right? People in Germany don't talk. Even Germany is all the changes and developments it's had since the war. They don't talk about the German Constitution. People don't hold the Constitution. Some a lot of Americans have the copy of the Constitution in their pocket. All kinds of the Constitution means so much more in the United States than it does in most other countries, and I think the reason for that is that it's always been this running and compromise. Okay, I'll leave it there. I'll watch the video when I put it up around noon today, and you'll get more. You'll get more depth, and you'll get more, again, more of those images and artifacts that I love to talk about so much. So, questions? Josh, you have a question? You're lighting up like Jeopardy. Skylar, you're
I was
lighting up.
going to say you'd muted yourself.
Oh, okay. Thanks. I just did. I did that to drink my coffee, and then I unmuted myself. Okay. All right. Well, I can say adios then if you want. As I say, keep watching the module for other stuff, and go on the discussion board and start chatting, start talking.
Thank
Okay.
you. Have a good
Okay.
one.
Have a good
Right.
day.
Adios.